The View from Saturday, Chapter 8. After defeating Knightsbridge, the Souls started drilling for the regionals. There were 8 regions in the state. Each was named for a major body of water that touched the countries within its boundary. They were named for lakes, great and small, for rivers flowing south or east, and one was named for a sound, the Long Island Sound. Epiphany was in the region called Finger Lakes. Finger Lakes had never won the state championship. The Hudson River, which included Maxwell Middle School, had won 3 out of the past 4 years. The week before the regionals, Mrs. Olinsky arranged with Mrs. Lawrenson to have the school opened on Saturday afternoon so they could have an extra drill. Her team had always been willing, even eager to practice, so she was surprised and disappointed when they refused. Finally, Noah spoke. "No disrespect intended, Mrs. Olinsky, but we would prefer not to." "No disrespect, but..." "But what?" "But they prefer not to?" "What happens on Saturday that is more important than an extra practice session?" she asked. Noah answered, "We have tea. On Saturdays, we all have tea." "You have tea?" she asked. "Yes," Noah said, "we have tea." "At Sillington House?" Nadia added. "At 4, Ethan added. Then Julian said, "Tea is always at 4, Mrs. Olinsky." Mr. Singh's teas at Sillington House were becoming well known in the community, and Mrs. Olinsky remembered her half-promise to herself after the matinee of Annie. She would have another cup of slow tea, and the children just had extended a half invitation. 2 halves make a whole, she thought. She would go to tea at Sillington House at 4 o'clock on Saturday afternoon. At precisely 3:45, Mrs. Olinsky locked the door to her house, got in her van, and drove to Sillington House. She arrived at 4 and had hardly let herself down from her van when she saw the front door swing open and Mr. Singh come down the path to the curb. He insisted upon wheeling her up the ramp, across the wide porch. He paused before they entered the front hall and said, "We are glad you have come, Mrs. Olinsky." "Why?" she asked. "Because Sillington House is its own place, Mrs. Olinsky. You will soon see." He wheeled her through the front hall and into the dining room where the Souls were standing behind a table in the back. There were 2 tables where paying guests were already seated. They smiled and nodded at her in the approving way people do when they see people in wheelchairs. Mr. Singh wheeled her around to the side of the table opposite the Souls. They greeted her, quietly, in unison. One word. They said, "Welcome." A place had been set at the end of the side table, away from the wall. Handicap parking, she thought. Julian said, "We have not yet poured your tea, Mrs. Olinsky. We did not want it to get cold." Ethan poured. Mrs. Olinsky lifted her cup in a silent toast and slowly sipped. Even before replacing her cup in its saucer, she once again felt something lift from her shoulders. She nibbled on the small sandwiches with no crust and soft fillings and ate the tiny tarts with bites as delicate as the tarts themselves. Mrs. Olinsky felt this sensation was so strange to her that she hardly remembered the word. Relaxed. She could not remember a time since her accident, maybe even before it, when she had not forced herself not to notice people noticing her. Yet the children watched her eat cake and drink tea, and she did not feel at all self-conscious. Mrs. Olinsky finished the last of the miniature cream puffs, delicately touched her napkin to the corners of her mouth, folded it, laid it on the table alongside her saucer, lifted her eyes, and saw 4 smiles adorn the faces opposite her. She returned their smiles with a grin. Other paying guests had arrived. The Souls excused themselves as they made trips in and out of the kitchen, bringing tea and tiered trays of tea sandwiches and cakes. They rejoined Mrs. Olinsky at her table and waited until the creased V between her eyes smoothed out and disappeared altogether. Then, when the last of the paying guests had paid his check, Noah said, "We begin practice after we clear up." There was a tip under the rim of the saucer on each of the tables of the paying guests. Whoever picked up the money put it into a box on the sideboard, to which a small sign, written in calligraphy, said, "To ensure promptness." After the Souls had disappeared into the kitchen, Mr. Singh came out. He laid several packs of note cards on the table and sat across from the table from Mrs. Olinsky. He sat with his back as straight as his chair and said, "They were getting worried, Mrs. Olinsky." "Who was?" "The Souls, Mrs. Olinsky." "The Souls?" she repeated. "Who are the Souls?" It would be more proper to ask, "What are the Souls?" "All right, then. What are the Souls?" "The Souls, Mrs. Olinsky, are what Noah, Nadia, Ethan, and Julian have become. Do you understand?" "No, Mr. Singh, I'm afraid I don't. Is this some strange Indian philosophy, Mr. Singh? Reincarnation, that sort of thing?" He smiled. His smile was as white as his turban and almost as broad. "An incarnation, perhaps, not a reincarnation." Nadia chose the name. "Why were they getting worried?" They worried, Mrs. Olinsky, because you were on the verge of choosing another. Such a choice would have been disastrous. Mrs. Olinsky had never told anyone that she had been on the verge of choosing another. She grew uneasy. Why was Mr. Singh destroying the wonderful, relaxed feeling she had only minutes ago? She nervously cleared her throat. But I did not, she said defensively. Yes, it was most fortunate. They've been waiting, Mrs. Olinsky. She said, I'm afraid I still don't understand. Waiting for what? What are you trying to tell me, Mr. Singh? He smiled. The white of his teeth made a dazzling underline to his turban. Just think about this, will you? You have never been able to explain how you chose the members of your team. You have given answers, but no explanations. How did he know that? Think of the atom, Mrs. Olinsky. There were energies within that tiny realm that are invisible but produce visible results. Mr. Singh shook his head slowly. Do not feel uneasy, Mrs. Olinsky. Hamilton Knapp would truly have been a terrible choice. Mrs. Olinsky had never told anyone, that she had been on the verge of choosing Hamilton Knapp. How could Mr. Singh tell her not to be uneasy when everything he said made her uneasy? Mr. Singh stood. Later, he said. Later you will understand. But for now, we would like to express our gratitude for realizing that Julian was the necessary soul. She nodded. All right, she said. Later. He pushed the packets of cards in front of her. Would you like to be quizmaster today? I guess I would. I'll send them in. They are ready to begin. She absent-mindedly turned over the cards. There was one question per card, just like hers, but these were written, not typed. The writing was calligraphic, the paper white, the ink as black as Hecate's soul. She examined the questions. They were good ones, and hardly noticed when the children had come out of the kitchen and taken places at the table on the opposite side of her. Who wrote these? She asked. Noah said, We all did. I gave Julian a calligraphy kit for our first Saturday, and I taught them all. Who made up the questions? You made up some, Julian said, and the rest of us contributed others. You too, Mr. Singh? Mr. Singh bowed slightly from the waist. My specialties are languages and weights and measures. Cooks must know weights and measures. Mrs. Olinsky laughed. Where did you come up with that category? I'm a big fan of Jeopardy on the television. When Julian and I lived on the cruise ship, they very often had quiz contests to amuse the patrons. This happened very often when the weather was bad. He bowed again. If you will be quizmaster today, Mrs. Olinsky, I shall return to my kitchen. I am trying out new recipes for bran muffins. Americans care very much for bran. I learned all of this when I was on the cruise ship. He smiled. We must talk again, Mrs. Olinsky. Noah was saying, There are some holes we need to plug, Mrs. Olinsky. What are they? She asked. Julian answered, Music and the Bible. Noah said, I keep telling Julian that we can skip the Bible. When I watch Jeopardy with Papa, the Bible is very often a category. I think we need it. Noah said, Fact. This is New York, not India, not England, and certainly not a cruise ship. This is New York, and fact. There is the law. There is no way anyone involved with teaching in a public school in the state of New York is going to quiz anyone who is in school at taxpayer expense on the Bible. They'd be slapped with 14 lawsuits before the buzzer finished sounding. Don't you agree that's a fact, Mrs. Olinsky? Mrs. Olinsky was not thinking about facts. She was thinking about their name, the Souls. I like it, she said aloud. You like the Bible? Well, yes, she replied. I like the Bible. As literature, as history, I'm comfortable with it as a category. Noah sighed. Does that mean the New Testament and the Old Testament? Wouldn't hurt, Mrs. Olinsky replied. And the Quran? Wouldn't hurt, Mrs. Olinsky replied. And the Upanishads? Julian asked. Those too? Noah asked. Wouldn't hurt, they all said in unison. And then they all laughed until Noah caught on and laughed too. It was dark when Mrs. Olinsky left Sillington House, and she was glad. The dark wrapped the afternoon around her and kept it close. Sillington House was its own place. She lifted one hand from the steering wheel, whipped it off to one side, and snapped her fingers. She laughed. The Finger Lakes Regional Championship was in the bag.